The disappearance of Madeleine Beth McCann on the evening of 3rd May 2007 stands as one of the most perplexing and enduring mysteries of the 21st century. At just 3 years old, Madeleine vanished from a holiday apartment in the seaside village of Praia da Luz, located on Portugal's Algarve coast, while her parents, Jerry and Kate McCann, were dining with friends at a nearby restaurant. Despite the physical proximity of the parents, checking on their children at intervals, and the seeming safety of the resort setting, Madeleine was gone without a trace in a matter of minutes. The speed, mystery, and apparent lack of conclusive evidence ensured that her disappearance became not only a criminal investigation, but also a cultural phenomenon, shaping debates around parenting, policing, media ethics, and international law enforcement cooperation. From the outset, the case was unlike most missing child reports. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, Madeleine's photograph and story had been disseminated across Europe and beyond. Newspapers in Britain gave it front-page coverage, and international television news outlets treated it as a lead story for days on end. The McCann family themselves became unusually prominent public figures in the wake of the tragedy, participating in press conferences, issuing direct appeals for their daughter's safe return, and establishing a campaign and fund to aid the search. This level of visibility was partly organic, reflecting public sympathy for a small child's plight, but also deliberately cultivated, as the McCanns and their advisors believed that media exposure could increase the chances of finding Madeleine alive. Their approach would become both highly praised and deeply criticized, making the McCann case a reference point in later discussions of how families of missing persons should, or should not, engage with the media. The disappearance also drew attention because of its sheer improbability. Praia da Luz was regarded as a tranquil, tourist-friendly village, popular with British and Irish holidaymakers, where violent crime was rare. The notion that a child could be taken from her bed in a locked or semi-secure apartment, while her family and friends were close at hand, struck many as almost inconceivable. This sense of shock only deepened as days turned into weeks and months, without resolution. The apparent absence of forensic evidence, the conflicting witness statements, and the uncertainty over timelines combined to create a puzzle that eluded both Portuguese and British investigators, despite immense resources. Another factor in the case's significance is its role in international law enforcement cooperation. Because the McCanns are British nationals, and Madeleine's disappearance occurred in Portugal, the investigation immediately involved multiple jurisdictions. Later, as leads emerged in Germany and beyond, the scope widened further. This multi-state involvement highlighted the difficulties of cross-border policing in Europe. Differences in investigative procedure, evidentiary standards, and even linguistic nuance sometimes hindered progress. The launch of the UK's Operation Grange in 2011, a dedicated Metropolitan Police Service review and investigation, underscored both the determination to solve the case and the challenges of sustaining such an inquiry across nearly 2 decades. The Madeleine McCann case also had significant legal and cultural ripple effects. British newspapers faced record libel payouts for their coverage, after sensationalist reporting targeted individuals later proven uninvolved. Books, documentaries, and television programs proliferated, blurring the line between reporting and speculation. Internet forums and social media accelerated rumor circulation, amplifying both public sympathy and suspicion. The case thus became an early example of how the digital media age could intensify and sometimes distort the course of a criminal investigation. Finally, the enduring mystery of Madeleine's fate gives the case its haunting power. Unlike other high-profile crimes where perpetrators are eventually identified or victims are found, Madeleine remains officially missing. No definitive evidence has ever explained what happened in the 90-minute window on 3rd May 2007, and every official inquiry, Portuguese, British, or German, has ended without resolution. This uncertainty ensures that the case remains not just a closed chapter of history, but a living, unresolved question. 18 years later, the name Madeleine McCann still resonates globally, symbolizing both the fragility of childhood safety and the limits of modern investigative reach. The evening of Thursday, 3rd May 2007, began like many others during the McCann family's week-long holiday in Praia da Luz, Portugal. The Ocean Club Resort, where they were staying, offered a relaxed rhythm of sunlit poolside days and dinners at the on-site tapas restaurant. Kate and Jerry McCann, both medical professionals from Leicestershire, England, were on holiday with a group of friends, later dubbed by the press the Tapas Seven, most of whom were also doctors or professionals with children of their own. Together, they had adopted a routine of leaving their children asleep in the resort apartments while the adults shared evening meals at the tapas bar, just a short walk away. The McCanns were staying in apartment 5A, a ground floor unit near the pool. Inside were their 3 children, Madeleine, age 3, and her younger twin siblings, 2-year-old Sean and Amelie. The twins shared a travel cot in the parents' bedroom, while Madeleine slept in a single bed in the children's room. The apartment's patio doors faced a small courtyard with a gate leading out toward the pool and restaurant area. The front door opened onto a public car park and was usually locked. The back patio doors, however, were often left unlocked for convenience, a choice that would later become one of the most scrutinized details of the case. On previous nights of the holiday, the group of adults had developed a system. They would leave the children in their respective apartments and check on them at intervals of 30 minutes. The tapas restaurant was about 90 meters, 180, now 195 feet, from the McCann's apartment, depending on the path taken. Though close enough to feel convenient, the restaurant did not have a direct line of sight to apartment 5A. The group considered the arrangement safe, a judgment shaped by the informal culture of the resort and the perception that Praia da Luz was a sleepy, low-crime destination. On the 3rd May, the tapas group included the McCanns, Jane Tanner and her partner Russell O'Brien, Rachel Oldfield and her husband Matthew Oldfield, David and Fiona Payne, and Fiona's mother, Diane Webster. They sat at their usual table in the outdoor dining area, with wine and dinner courses served in stages, while the evening check-ins on the children were performed in rotation, 20, 30. The adults arrived at the tapas restaurant. The children were already asleep in their apartments, including Madeleine and her siblings. 21 sours. The first checks began. Jerry McCann returned to the apartment to check on Madeleine and the twins. He later reported that all 3 children were asleep and that everything seemed normal. As he exited through the patio doors, he briefly spoke with another holidaymaker, Jeremy Wilkins, who was out walking his child, 21 to 2015, Jane Tanner, another member of the group, passed Jerry and Wilkins on the street as she returned from her own apartment. Tanner later reported seeing a man crossing the road ahead of her, carrying a child in light-colored pajamas. She described the child as being barefoot and possibly wrapped in a blanket, though her account would later vary in detail over time. This Tanner sighting initially became central to the timeline. 21:30, 21:40. Matthew Oldfield offered to check on the McCann children during one of his rounds. He later stated that he entered the McCann's apartment but did not fully look into the bedroom. He noticed the twins sleeping and assumed Madeleine was asleep as well, though he admitted he did not see her directly. 22. Kate McCann left the table to conduct her check. Entering the apartment, she noticed the door to the children's bedroom was more open than she had left it. On approaching, she discovered Madeleine's bed was empty. A frantic search of the apartment and surrounding area followed, with Jerry and friends quickly alerted. Within minutes of Kate's discovery, the group and resort staff began searching nearby paths, gardens, and buildings. Local police were notified around 22:10, 22:15, and by 23:00, a full search was underway, including holidaymakers and resort employees. Reports of unusual sightings began circulating almost instantly, but the information was scattered and unverified. Among the most significant was the Smith sighting, later recalled by an Irish family, the Smiths, who reported seeing a man carrying a young girl around 22:10 near the beach area, about 500 meters from the McCann's apartment. Unlike the Tanner sighting, this account came to prominence later in the investigation, and its description of the child's clothing was less precise. The initial hours were marked by confusion and the absence of systematic coordination. Neighbors and tourists joined in the search, but the apartment was not immediately secured as a crime scene. Doors and windows were opened and closed. Footprints were made in and around the premises, and items were moved, all of which would later complicate forensic analysis. This chaotic beginning set the tone for much of the investigation's difficulties. An early sense of urgency mixed with procedural missteps, missed opportunities for evidence preservation, and reliance on witness testimony that was fragmentary and inconsistent. Responsibility for investigating Madeleine McCann's disappearance fell to Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, PAU, specifically their criminal investigation department in Portimão. The PJ is Portugal's main criminal investigation force, roughly comparable to Britain's CID or the FBI in its remit for serious crimes. At the time, their resources were limited compared to large metropolitan forces in the UK, and they faced sudden global scrutiny from media and foreign law enforcement almost overnight. From the first hours, investigators were confronted with a crime scene already compromised by well-meaning searchers, resort staff, and holidaymakers. Potential fingerprints, footprints, and trace evidence in apartment 5A may have been disturbed. This fact haunted the case thereafter. Portuguese officers insisted they had done their best under immense pressure, while critics, particularly in the British press, argued the investigation was disorganized and lacked urgency. Initially, the PJ pursued three broad lines of inquiry. 1. Abduction by a stranger, either opportunistic or planned, perhaps by a pedophile or child trafficker. 2. Burglary gone wrong, theorizing that Madeleine woke up during a break-in and was removed to prevent her from raising the alarm. 3. Involvement of the parents or friends, based on inconsistencies in witness statements, the unusual dining arrangement, and later forensic leads. All three hypotheses remained in circulation for months, with emphasis shifting depending on developments in the investigation. By mid-May 2007, the PJ's attention had turned briefly to Robert Murat, a British expatriate living near the resort with his mother. Murat volunteered to help police as a translator in the early days, but his behavior aroused suspicion among journalists, some of whom privately passed on their doubts to Portuguese investigators. On 15th of May 2007, Murat was declared an arguido, formal suspect, and his home was searched. However, no evidence linked him to the disappearance, and he was eventually cleared in 2008 when the case was archived. The intense press focus on Murat, later acknowledged as misplaced, culminated in substantial libel settlements with British newspapers who had wrongly portrayed him as guilty. By the summer of 2007, frustration over the lack of progress led the PJ to shift focus. Several officers, including the case coordinator Gonçalo Amaral, began to suspect that the disappearance might not have been a stranger abduction. The McCanns' decision to publicize Madeleine's image worldwide and their use of press conferences and celebrity endorsements were viewed by some Portuguese officials as uncharacteristic behavior for grieving parents. Cultural differences amplified this tension. In the UK, the McCanns' media strategy was seen as proactive. In Portugal, investigators saw it as potentially manipulative. On the 6th September 2007, Kate McCann was formally declared an arguida, followed the next day by Jerry. As arguidos, they had the right to remain silent and to have legal counsel during questioning. Portuguese investigators believed there were inconsistencies in their statements, particularly around the evening's timeline, the apartment's windows and doors, and how wide the children's bedroom door had been when Kate checked. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigation involved the deployment of 2 British specialist dogs, trained by handler Martin Grime. Eddie, cadaver dog, alerted to several locations, including behind the sofa in apartment 5A, and to the boot of a rental car later hired by the McCanns. Keela, blood dog, also indicated potential traces in some of these areas. These alerts generated worldwide headlines and were cited by Portuguese authorities as grounds for suspicion against the parents. However, when forensic samples were analyzed by the Forensic Science Service, FSS, in the UK, the results were inconclusive. The DNA recovered was low copy, mixed profiles with multiple contributors. Scientists concluded that the data was too complex and partial to establish a reliable link to Madeleine. This clash between canine alerts, considered only indicative evidence, and inconclusive lab findings fueled bitter disputes between the PJ and the McCann supporters. In the end, no court accepted the dog findings as sufficient to prove a crime had occurred inside apartment 5A. Throughout 2007, relations between the Portuguese and British press became increasingly fraught. UK tabloids criticized the PJ for incompetence. Portuguese outlets accused the British press of arrogance and interference. Gonçalo Amaral, the case's coordinator, became a polarizing figure. He publicly criticized the McCanns' media campaign and complained about British police pressure. In October 2007, following comments to a Portuguese newspaper that disparaged UK detectives, Amaral was removed from the case and reassigned. He would later publish a controversial book in 2008, A Verdade da Mentira, The Truth of the Lie, in which he advanced a theory that Madeleine died in the apartment and that her parents concealed the body. His claims sparked years of litigation. By July 2008, with no decisive forensic evidence, no credible suspect, and contradictory witness accounts, Portugal's Attorney General declared the investigation archived, effectively suspended. The arguido status of Kate and Jerry McCann, as well as Robert Murat, was lifted. Officially, the case could be reopened if significant new evidence emerged, but the Portuguese inquiry largely went dormant. This archiving marked the end of the first phase of the Madeleine McCann case. For the McCanns, it was both a relief, clearing them of formal suspicion, and a source of frustration, as the disappearance of their daughter remained unexplained. For Portugal's PJ, it was a humbling outcome. One of the most internationally scrutinized cases in their history had yielded no resolution. From the moment Madeleine McCann was reported missing on 3rd May 2007, the case captured headlines worldwide. What began as a local missing child report on Portugal's Algarve coast became, within 24 hours, a front-page story in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and across continental Europe. This immediate internationalization was fueled by several factors: the McCann status as British professionals, the unusual circumstances of a child vanishing from her bed while her parents were nearby, and the rapid mobilization of press conferences and appeals. The McCanns themselves leaned heavily into the media strategy. They released photographs of Madeleine, engaged with journalists daily, and even enlisted celebrities such as David Beckham and Pope Benedict XVI to amplify awareness. Their aim was clear: keeping Madeleine's image alive in the public consciousness in the hope that someone, somewhere, might provide a decisive lead. However, this high-profile campaign also opened the family to scrutiny. The British press, particularly the tabloid sector, alternated between sympathy-driven coverage and suspicion-fueled speculation. Madeleine's distinctive coloboma, a rare eye condition leaving a small defect in her right iris, became a focal point of media appeals, with posters and front pages urging the public worldwide to look for the eye. Hocht. But by mid-2007, when Portuguese police began treating the McCanns as arguidos, the same newspapers pivoted toward darker narratives, at times insinuating parental involvement without evidence. The case highlighted the competitive and often reckless culture of tabloid journalism in the UK, with circulation battles raging among papers such as the Daily Express, Daily Star, Sun, and Daily Mail. Editors prioritized sensationalism. Headlines speculated wildly. Theories about sedative overdoses, staged abductions, and secret disposal of Madeleine's body appeared in bold type on front pages. Much of this reporting was fueled by unattributed leaks from Portuguese police sources, sometimes mistranslated or misrepresented. Because Portugal operates under judicial secrecy during investigations, official statements were scarce, leaving room for rumor. British journalists stationed in Praia da Luz filled the vacuum with conjecture, which then made its way into millions of homes each morning. This coverage created a feedback loop. Public suspicion against the McCanns in Portugal intensified, feeding further leaks and headlines abroad. By late 2007, relations between the McCanns and the press were strained, with their spokespersons regularly denouncing false reports. The recklessness of this reporting came to a head in 2008. In March of that year, Express newspapers, publishers of the Daily Express and Daily Star, issued unprecedented front-page apologies to the McCanns. The papers admitted their stories had suggested the parents were responsible for Madeleine's disappearance, claims that were entirely untrue and grossly defamatory. Disarm. The group paid damages reported at $550,000, which the McCanns donated to the fund supporting the search for their daughter. Other individuals wrongly implicated also sought redress. Robert Murat, the British expatriate neighbor made an arguido early in the investigation, won $600,000 in damages from a group of UK newspapers that had falsely branded him suspicious. These settlements sent a shockwave through Fleet Street, underscoring the financial and reputational risks of unchecked speculation in high-profile cases. The lawsuits did little, however, to roll back the damage already done to public perceptions. For many readers, the suspicion planted by months of headlines had already hardened into belief, regardless of later corrections. The most enduring legal battle, however, stemmed not from the tabloid press, but from within Portugal itself. In July 2008, shortly after leaving the Polícia Judiciária, case coordinator Gonçalo Amaral published a book titled A Verdade da Mentira, The Truth of the Lie. In it, he put forward the theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents were involved in covering it up. The book, and a subsequent television documentary, reignited controversy. The McCanns sued Amaral in Portugal for libel, winning an initial judgment in 2015 that awarded them damages and banned sales of the book. But the ruling was overturned on appeal in 2016, with Portugal's higher courts affirming Amaral's right to express his opinion, however controversial, under the principle of freedom of expression. The dispute reached the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, which in 2022 upheld the Portuguese court's position. The ECHR emphasized that while the McCanns had a right to reputation, Amaral,'s freedom of expression, particularly as a former investigator writing about a matter of public interest, was also protected. Crucially, the ECHR ruling did not endorse Amaral,'s theory or suggest the McCanns were guilty. It simply established that Portuguese courts were entitled to allow his publication. The combined effect of tabloid speculation, libel suits, and Amaral,'s book was to create a divided public sphere. On one side stood those who sympathized with the McCanns, recognizing them as grieving parents subjected to an unfair trial by media. On the other stood those persuaded by Amaral,'s claims or the tabloid's early reporting, convinced the parents bore responsibility. This polarization was exacerbated by the rise of the internet. Online forums, blogs, and later social media platforms gave oxygen to conspiracy theories, many of which recycled or distorted claims from Amaral,'s book. To this day, online discussions of the case often devolve into bitter disputes, with little room for nuance. The McCann case became a case study in media ethics. Journalism schools in the UK and elsewhere cite it when teaching the dangers of trial by media, the importance of verifying sources, and the risks of relying on leaks. It also contributed to the Leveson inquiry into the British press, 2011-2012, which examined the culture, practices, and ethics of UK newspapers in the wake of the phone hacking scandal. At the same time, the case demonstrated the double-edged nature of publicity. Without massive media coverage, Madeleine's image would not have become instantly recognizable around the globe. Yet the very visibility that amplified awareness also opened the door to rumor, hostility, and suspicion, some of which continues to cloud the family's life nearly 2 decades later. By 2011, 4 years after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the Portuguese inquiry had been archived for nearly 3 years. The McCanns had continued their own campaign, hiring private investigators and lobbying politicians to keep the case alive. Public pressure remained high in Britain, where many believed the investigation in Portugal had been mishandled and prematurely suspended. That May, at the personal request of the McCanns, and under direct urging from then Prime Minister David Cameron, the UK's Metropolitan Police Service, MPS, launched a new effort, Operation Grange. At first, this was framed as a review of the evidence rather than a fresh investigation. The aim was to re-examine all available material from Portugal, the UK, and private investigations to identify new lines of inquiry. The scope was enormous. Thousands of witness statements, photographs, phone records, and tips had accumulated across several jurisdictions. The MPS assembled a dedicated team of detectives within its Homicide and Serious Crime Command, initially comprising around 40 officers, to comb through this mountain of evidence. Detectives quickly identified inconsistencies and gaps in the original Portuguese case files. They noted that some witnesses had not been re-interviewed, potential leads had not been fully pursued, and timelines were muddled. The review emphasized the need to reassess witness sightings, particularly those between 21,000 and 2215 on 3rd May 2007. Examine reports of suspicious men in and around Praia da Luz in the days before the disappearance. Investigate alleged break-ins and burglaries in the resort area. Analyze phone records and digital communications with modern forensic tools unavailable in 2007. By 2012, the UK Home Office agreed to fund the project as an active investigation, not just a review. Operation Grange officially became a criminal inquiry in its own right, though always in liaison with Portuguese authorities, who retained primary jurisdiction. The most dramatic moment of Operation Grange came in October 2013, when the BBC broadcast a special edition of Crime Watch dedicated to the case. It was a turning point in how the investigation was publicly framed. The program included a 30-minute reconstruction of the evening of 3rd May 2007, filmed in Spain to resemble Praia da Luz, interviews with detectives and the McCanns, who appealed once again for information, release of new ECHR images of a man seen carrying a child around 22 Daus, the Smith sighting, clarification about the earlier Tanner sighting, which Operation Grange had concluded almost certainly involved an innocent British tourist carrying his own daughter home from the night creche. This was a profound shift. For years, the Tanner sighting at 2115 had dominated public narratives, shaping speculation about Madeleine being abducted earlier in the evening. By eliminating this as a lead, the MPS refocused attention on a later window of opportunity, closer to the time Kate McCann discovered Madeleine missing. The Crime Watch broadcast was aired simultaneously in the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, with appeals tailored to each audience. Hotlines received more than 1,000 calls and emails in the immediate aftermath. Key developments from the reset. 1. Re-emphasis on the Smith sighting. 22 1010. The Irish family's account of a man carrying a child became central. New ECHRs based on their recollections were released, generating fresh leads. 2. Suspicious activity around the resort. Several witnesses recalled men acting oddly in the days before Madeleine vanished, posing as charity collectors, loitering near apartments, or watching families. Detectives appealed for information on these individuals. 3. Phone records. The MPS reported that a significant volume of mobile phone data from Praia da Luz at the time had been recovered. Analysts began mapping activity patterns to look for suspicious clusters. 4. Burglary theory revisited. Detectives explored whether Madeleine's disappearance could have been linked to a botched burglary, with perpetrators removing her when she awoke. This line of inquiry gained traction, but was never conclusively proven. While Operation Grange was welcomed in the UK, its reception in Portugal was more ambivalent. The Polícia Judiciária, PJ, had archived the case in 2008, and some Portuguese officials felt the British review implied criticism of their work. Nevertheless, under diplomatic and public pressure, the PJ agreed to reopen its own investigation in October 2013, citing new elements of evidence. From that point, the inquiries proceeded in parallel, with formal channels of cooperation between Lisbon and London. In practice, tensions persisted. Differing legal systems, approaches to evidence, and working cultures meant that coordination was often strained. Following the Crime Watch revelations and new intelligence, Operation Grange detectives requested permission to search areas of Praia da Luz. In June 2014, British and Portuguese teams conducted extensive digs and surveys in scrubland near the Ocean Club Resort. Ground-penetrating radar and sniffer dogs were used. Several pits were dug to test for disturbed soil or buried evidence. Media coverage was intense, with journalists and camera crews recording every move. After weeks of effort, police announced that no evidence linked to Madeleine had been found. Still, investigators argued that eliminating areas was as important as discovering new ones. The 2013 Crime Watch appeal reshaped how the case was seen. For many, it was the first time they understood that the Tanner sighting, a cornerstone of earlier reporting, had been discounted. It also reinforced the image of the Metropolitan Police as methodical and determined, contrasting with perceptions of the earlier PJ investigation. However, skeptics argued that despite the publicity, little concrete progress had been made. While the reset clarified timelines and refocused leads, it still produced no arrest, no definitive suspect, and no trace of Madeleine. Operation Grange gradually scaled down over the years, shrinking from around 40 detectives to fewer than 10 by the late 2010s. Yet it remained officially active, funded annually by the UK Home Office. Detectives maintained that they were pursuing a small number of significant lines of inquiry, though the details were rarely disclosed. By 2020, the most consequential lead would emerge from outside the Crime Watch effort, when German prosecutors announced they were investigating a new suspect, Christian Brückner. When Operation Grange was launched in May 2011, it began as a review funded by the UK Home Office at the request of then Prime Minister David Cameron. The decision was highly unusual. Rarely does a British Prime Minister intervene directly in a missing person investigation abroad, yet the McCann's case had become a matter of national concern, with heavy media coverage and lobbying from the family. The initial funding commitment was approximately $5 million, earmarked for reviewing Portuguese case files, collating intelligence, and determining whether new investigative avenues existed. The Metropolitan Police Service, MPS, stressed that while the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária, PJ, retained primary jurisdiction, the review would apply modern forensic and analytical techniques to material that had been collected between 2007 and 2008. By 2013, Operation Grange had transitioned from a review into a full-scale criminal investigation with a team of around 40 detectives. This required significant ongoing funding, with annual allocations from the Home Office. 2013-2014 resources expanded to cover the Crime Watch reconstruction and the first large-scale ground searches in Praia da Luz. The team's size at this point rivaled that of major homicide inquiries in London. Tetto in 2014-2016. Additional funds were approved, keeping the annual budget between $2 to $3 million. The justification was that new leads, particularly from mobile phone data and witness re-interviews, were being actively pursued. 2017 onward, with no breakthrough, Operation Grange was gradually scaled down. The number of detectives was reduced to fewer than 10, supported by intelligence analysts and forensic specialists as needed. The Home Office shifted to granting year-by-year extensions, each worth several £100,000. By this stage, Operation Grange was no longer a sprawling inquiry, but a focused investigation, targeting a small number of significant lines of inquiry. The Metropolitan Police have released official figures through Freedom of Information (FOI) requests. By March 2014, the cost of the operation stood at approximately $5.3 million. By April 2015, it had risen to around $10 million. By September 2022, the total expenditure was reported as $12.94 million. Additional funds were later approved to keep the investigation alive through 2023, 2024, and 2025, though at reduced staffing levels. For context, this places Operation Grange among the most expensive missing person investigations in British history. The trajectory of staffing reflects the investigation's changing priorities. Total 2011 to 2013, around 40 detectives, analysts, and support staff, comparable to a counter-terrorism inquiry. Till 2014, at the peak of activity during the Portuguese ground searches, more than 30 officers were deployed on site. 2015-2017, reduced to around 20 officers, focusing on follow-up inquiries, data analysis, and overseas liaison. 2018-2022, downsized to fewer than 10 officers, working part-time on case review intelligence checks, and forensic reassessment. 2022 FOI disclosure noted that the team was the equivalent of 1.4 full-time staff, essentially a skeleton unit dedicated to maintaining family liaison and pursuing any new viable lead. Despite this downsizing, senior MPS figures repeatedly insisted the investigation was ongoing rather than dormant. The high cost of Operation Grange has been a subject of controversy. Critics in the press and among the public have questioned whether devoting nearly $13 million to a single missing child case, especially one outside the UK, was justifiable when many other unsolved cases in Britain receive far fewer resources. Some families of other missing children express frustration that their loved ones' cases had not attracted similar political or financial support. Police officials countered that the McCann case was unique in its international profile, public interest, and potential to benefit from modern techniques applied to old evidence. The Home Office, while extending funding year by year, made clear in statements that resources were allocated based on professional policing assessments of whether viable lines of inquiry remained. Each extension was therefore framed as a recognition that detectives had not yet exhausted all possibilities. The challenge for Operation Grange has always been balancing public expectation with practical outcomes. While the public often expected dramatic breakthroughs, new suspects, arrests, or forensic discoveries, the reality was that much of the work involved reanalyzing phone records, cross-checking witness statements, and eliminating dead ends. By the mid-2020s, Operation Grange had evolved into a case-sustaining unit rather than an active large-scale hunt. The McCanns have consistently expressed gratitude for the funding and persistence of the British police, emphasizing that even after nearly 2 decades, knowing Madeleine's fate remains their central priority. On 3rd June 2020, German prosecutors in Braunschweig shocked the world with an announcement. They had identified a new suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The suspect was Christian Brückner, a 43-year-old German national with a long criminal record who had lived intermittently in the Algarve region of Portugal, including around Praia da Luz. At the time Madeleine vanished in 2007, prosecutors stated publicly that they believed Madeleine was dead and that Brückner was responsible for her disappearance. This was the first time any authority had made such a definitive claim. They asked the public for information about his movements and vehicles, hoping to strengthen their case. Born in 1976 in Würzburg, Germany, Brückner grew up in foster care and spent much of his youth in trouble with the law. His criminal record spanned burglary, drug offenses, child sexual abuse, and violent crime. He was known to drift between Germany, Portugal, and other European countries, often living a transient lifestyle. In Portugal, Brückner resided in the Algarve between the mid-1990s and early 2000s, sometimes working casual jobs and sometimes living off petty crime. He was known to stay in Praia da Luz, about a mile from the Ocean Club Resort, where he reportedly kept a small camper van and a Jaguar car. What drew investigators' attention was the fact that phone records placed him in Praia da Luz on the evening of 3rd May 2007, when Madeleine disappeared. Around an hour before Kate McCann raised the alarm, Brückner received a half-hour phone call on his Portuguese mobile. The identity of the other party remains undisclosed publicly, but the timing and location were considered highly significant. German prosecutors became involved because Brückner was serving time in Germany for other offenses, and under German law they had jurisdiction to investigate serious crimes committed abroad if the suspect was German. By 2020, he was already in prison for the rape of a 72-year-old American woman in Praia da Luz in 2005, a crime committed just 2 years before Madeleine vanished. The similarities in time, location, and his criminal pattern, violent sexual crimes against vulnerable victims, convinced German authorities that he was a strong suspect in the McCann case. Prosecutors released details of vehicles linked to Brückner. Taos. VW T3 camper van, described as yellow and white, in which he was believed to have lived near Praia da Luz. A Jaguar XJR6 car, which he re-registered to another individual shortly after Madeleine's disappearance. Witnesses were asked to come forward with any recollections of these vehicles around May 2007. Authorities also appealed for information about places where Brückner might have stayed, including remote properties, wells, and reservoirs in the Algarve. Following the 2020 announcement, cooperation intensified between German, British, and Portuguese police. German investigators repeatedly stated that they had concrete evidence of Madeleine's death, but did not disclose details, citing ongoing inquiries. In May 2023, large-scale searches were carried out at the Arad Reservoir, about 50 kilometers from Praia da Luz, where Brückner had reportedly spent time. Divers, sniffer dogs, and ground teams combed the area. Items were collected for analysis, though no conclusive link to Madeleine was announced. Brückner himself consistently denied involvement. Through his lawyers, he suggested that German prosecutors were unfairly targeting him because of his past crimes. In February 2024, Brückner went on trial in Braunschweig, Germany, facing charges of 5 sexual offenses said to have occurred between 2000 and 2017 in Portugal. These included the rape of 2 women, the sexual abuse of 2 girls, and the rape of a teenager. The trial was closely followed worldwide, as many hoped it might shed light on the McCann case. But Madeleine's disappearance was not formally part of the proceedings. The charges related only to other victims. On the 16th of October 2024, the Braunschweig court acquitted Brückner of all 5 charges, citing insufficient evidence and reliability issues with witness testimony. Prosecutors immediately announced their intention to appeal, signaling the case was not closed. Brückner remains a suspect in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. German prosecutors maintain their belief that he was involved, but admit they do not yet have evidence strong enough to charge him. Thus, he is expected to leave prison in 2025 when his existing sentence for the 2005 rape is completed, unless new charges succeed on appeal. UK and Portuguese authorities continue to liaise with German prosecutors, but no arrest or indictment has been issued in the McCann case. The naming of Brückner as a suspect reinvigorated international interest. For the first time in years, investigators had a named individual whose criminal profile, proximity, and timeline matched the circumstances of Madeleine's disappearance. Yet the case illustrates the central problem. Without direct evidence, DNA, a confession, or a credible witness, prosecutors cannot secure a conviction. The suspicion remains, but the mystery endures. By the early 2020s, the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance had entered its 2nd decade. Operation Grange in the UK was scaled down to a skeleton team, but German prosecutors' identification of Christian Brückner as a suspect in 2020 reinvigorated international cooperation. Investigators in Germany, Portugal, and the UK shared intelligence suggesting that areas linked to Brückner's movements during his time in the Algarve might hold undiscovered evidence. This focus on geographical traces, remote properties, reservoirs, and wells represented a return to physical searching after years of primarily analytical work with phone records and witness statements. The goal was clear: to locate any forensic material, such as clothing, objects, or even human remains, that might corroborate suspicions about Brückner's involvement. The most dramatic development came in May 2023, when police descended on the Arad Reservoir, about 50 kilometers east of Praia de Luz, near the town of Silve. The location was significant for two reasons. One, Brückner was known to have frequented the reservoir area, sometimes camping there. Two, witnesses recalled that he had described the spot as a paradise. The search was a joint operation between Portuguese police, German investigators, and Scotland Yard representatives. It lasted 3 days and involved teams of divers scouring the shallow waters, officers cutting back dense vegetation along the shoreline, sniffer dogs trained to detect human remains, the use of ground-penetrating equipment and soil sampling. Items including fabric remnants and plastic materials were collected and sent to laboratories in Germany for testing. While investigators confirmed the collection of several objects of interest, no public statement was made, linking them to Madeleine. Media reports later suggested the items were inconclusive, reinforcing the frustration of a case that continually raises hopes only to leave questions unanswered. In 2024 and 2025, further activity unfolded across rural Algarve sites believed to be associated with Brückner's past. These included wells scattered across farmland, some abandoned and rarely accessed. The theory was that a secluded well could have been used to conceal evidence of scrubland clearings near old roads and tracks, remote properties where Brückner was rumored to have stayed temporarily. The logistics of these searches were immense. Portugal's landscape in the Algarve includes miles of dry scrub, rocky terrain, and disused agricultural land. Each potential site required excavation or examination, yet none produced a breakthrough. As of early 2025, no item definitively connected to Madeleine had been recovered. German prosecutors reiterated their belief that she was dead and that Brückner was responsible, but acknowledged that the searches had not provided the decisive proof required for charges. The operations, even though inconclusive, served several functions. One, demonstrating persistence. Authorities showed the public and the McCann family that the case had not been abandoned. Two, applying pressure. Renewed activity signaled to Brückner and others that investigators were not giving up, perhaps in the hope of triggering confessions or new witness testimony. 3. Narrowing the field. By eliminating potential sites of interest, investigators reduced the number of plausible hiding places or evidence caches. Media coverage of the searches was intense, with international crews once again converging on the Algarve. For many, the images of police digging by the reservoir evoked memories of the 2007-2008 efforts and reinforced the lingering emotional power of the case. Despite the scale of these renewed searches, the central challenge remained unchanged. Without physical or forensic evidence, suspicion cannot translate into charges. The Portuguese landscape is vast, and nearly 2 decades have passed since Madeleine disappeared. Time, weather, and human activity all erode the likelihood of recovering decisive material. Yet investigators argue that searches must continue as long as credible intelligence exists. For the McCanns, each new effort carries both painful uncertainty and renewed hope. The chance, however slim, that the truth might finally emerge. Within 2 weeks of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, Portuguese police named their first arguido, Robert Murat, a British expatriate who lived near the Ocean Club Resort with his mother. Murat had volunteered to act as a translator in the early stages of the investigation, since he was fluent in both Portuguese and English. This placed him at the center of police operations from the outset. However, journalists and some holidaymakers began to view his behavior as unusual, claiming he seemed overly eager to involve himself. Under pressure, the Polícia Judiciária, PJ, formally made him a suspect on 15th of May 2007. His home and property were searched extensively, and his communications scrutinized. Despite these efforts, no evidence was found linking Murat to Madeleine's disappearance. He was never charged, and when the Portuguese Attorney General archived the case in July 2008, his arguido status was lifted. In the years that followed, Murat successfully sued several British newspapers for libel, securing $600,000 in damages after they wrongly portrayed him as guilty. For Murat, the experience was devastating. He later described being unable to find work, his reputation ruined, and his family deeply affected by false accusations. His ordeal became emblematic of how quickly suspicion, amplified by the media, can destroy the life of an innocent man caught in the storm of a high-profile case. The McCanns were dining with 7 friends on the night of 3rd May 2007. Jane Tanner and her partner Russell O'Brien, Rachel and Matthew Oldfield, David and Fiona Payne, and Fiona's mother, Diane Webster. Together with the McCanns, they became known in the press as the Tapas 7. Their role in the investigation was crucial. They were the last adults known to see Madeleine alive, and their account shaped the official timeline. The group stated that they had adopted a system of regular checks on their children throughout the evening, each taking turns to leave the tapas bar and walk to their respective apartments. However, under police questioning, inconsistencies emerged. Some details about who checked when and what exactly they saw conflicted with others. For example, Matthew Oldfield admitted he had entered the McCann's apartment around 21:30, but only glanced into the bedroom without verifying whether Madeleine was in bed. Jane Tanner's account of seeing a man carrying a child at 21:15 also did not align perfectly with Jerry McCann's reported sighting of another holidaymaker, Jeremy Wilkins, on the same street at the same time. While the PJ grew suspicious of these inconsistencies, British detectives defended the group, arguing that discrepancies were natural in traumatic situations and late-night recollections. None of the Tapas 7 were ever declared arguidos, though critics of the McCanns often suggested their testimony was unreliable. Perhaps the most famous witness account came from Jane Tanner, who claimed she saw a man carrying a small child across Rua Dr. Agostinho da Silva at approximately 21:15, just as Jerry McCann was speaking to Jeremy Wilkins outside the apartment. She described the man as slim, dark-haired, and carrying a child dressed in pale pajamas. This account dominated early theories, leading investigators to assume Madeleine had been taken earlier than 22 past. For years, the Tanner sighting was treated as pivotal. However, in 2013, Operation Grange detectives publicly concluded that the man Tanner saw was almost certainly an innocent British tourist, carrying his own child home from the night crash. The man came forward after recognizing himself in media descriptions. His timeline matched, and police determined that this explained Tanner's sighting. This revelation dramatically reframed the investigation, effectively removing what had been considered one of the strongest leads. Less well known initially, but later regarded as more significant, was the Smith sighting. Around 22:00 and 22:10, an Irish family, the Smiths from Drogheda, reported seeing a man carrying a sleeping girl down a street toward the beach. The man was described as being in his 30s, of medium build, with light-colored trousers and a child in pale pajamas. Crucially, this timing aligned more closely with Kate McCann's discovery of Madeleine missing around 22:00. In 2008, the family provided detailed e-fits to investigators, but these were not widely publicized until the 2013 Crime Watch appeal. By then, the Smith sighting had become central to Operation Grange's theory of events. Detectives considered it consistent with an abduction closer to the 22 Tokot mark, not earlier. The Smith family later said that in televised footage, the man's walking style resembled Jerry McCann's. However, they emphasized that this was an impression, not an identification, and the police never treated Jerry as a suspect on this basis after his arguido status was lifted. Instead, investigators viewed the sighting as evidence of a possible abductor carrying Madeleine away. Over the years, dozens of other reported sightings flooded in, across Portugal, Spain, Morocco, and even as far as India and Australia. These were almost universally discounted after investigation, with no credible evidence linking them to Madeleine. Closer to Praia da Luz, reports surfaced of men behaving suspiciously around the Ocean Club in the days before 3rd May. Some posed as charity collectors or loitered near apartments. Operation Grange later emphasized these accounts, suggesting potential reconnaissance of families. The conflicting witness accounts underscore one of the greatest difficulties in the case. On one hand, eyewitness testimony is invaluable in reconstructing events. On the other, human memory is fallible, especially under stress. Lighting conditions, fatigue, and assumptions can distort recollections. The Tanner sighting, once considered a cornerstone, ultimately turned out to be unrelated. The Smith sighting, which seemed less important at first, gained prominence years later. This shifting emphasis highlights how fragile timelines can be in complex investigations, and how easy it is for initial narratives to dominate public understanding, even if later disproven.